Hi, all. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll get started in just a minute. All right. Thank you all so much for joining us for today's webinar, Factory Farm Gas, Big Oil, and Big Ag's latest greenwashing scheme. My name is Molly Armis. I am the Animal Agriculture Policy Program Manager for Friends of the Earth. Just before we get started, a couple housekeeping things. If you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function. We'll also be answering some of the questions that were submitted ahead of time. And then finally, we are recording this webinar and we'll share the recording with everyone who registered. So if you have to jump off early or you're only listening, you'll be able to check it out afterwards. So this webinar is going to highlight some exciting new research, as well as the community impacts of the proliferation of factory farm gas, also known as manure biogas. And we'll discuss how this greenwashed approach to climate mitigation undermines environmental justice, it perpetuates the climate crisis, and it hurts small and sustainable livestock producers. And so just to introduce some of our speakers really quickly. First up, we'll have Kat Ruane, who is a researcher at Food and Water Watch, and she will be discussing their new report, the Big Oil and Big Ag Ponzi Scheme, Factory Farm Biogas. Then you'll hear from Chris Hunt, who is the Deputy Director for the Socially Responsible Agriculture Project, and Chloe Waterman, who is the Senior Program Manager of Climate Friendly Foods for Friends of the Earth. And they'll share new highlights from their new report, Biogas or Bold, the deceptive promise of manure biogas as a methane solution. And then finally, we'll hear from Leslie Martinez, who is the Community Engagement Specialist at Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability, based in Fresno, California. She'll be discussing their work with communities in California's Central Valley and the issues that they're facing from industrial dairy operations and the build out of factory farm gas. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Kat.
Great. Thank you, Molly. Hi, everyone, and thank you to Friends of the Earth for having me on today. Like Molly said, I'm going to be talking about Food and Water Watch's newest report, which really gets into the ways that big oil is also getting involved in the factory farm gas or the biogas industry. So I'm here to share those findings with you. With that said, first slide, please. So before we get into all of the details, just a quick description of what factory farm gas actually is for those who may not be familiar with the subject. So at a very high level, this biogas or factory farm gas is a mixture of gases produced from animal manure or other byproducts. So that could include things like animal trimmings, poultry litter, or a variety of other waste products. This kind of gross mixture is put inside these huge tanks known as anaerobic digesters. It stews in there, lets the bacteria work, and then out comes this gas. Now, because the digester can't, make all of the original inputs just disappear, you also get this digestate coming out of it. And this digestate is usually a liquid or solid sludge, just the remains of everything that went in. And I'm not going to go into detail about that now, but just know this is often reapplied to land as fertilizer, and it comes with its own host of environmental problems. Next slide, please. So as for the gas itself that's coming out, there are several different uses for it. One of those would be to use it for electricity or heating systems on the farm itself, or you could also sell it back into the local grid. But what we're seeing more commonly is that these factory farms or these oil companies or these middlemen are choosing to refine this raw product, removing the impurities from it and turning it into a fuel that can be piped through a pipeline. And one of the big names that the industry likes to tout is renewable natural gas, or RNG. And of course, it goes without saying that calling something renewable does not make it renewable. And as we'll hear today, it is nowhere near renewable. You may also hear it being referred to as compressed natural gas, or CNG, or liquefied natural gas, or LNG. These are kind of different forms it can take. But fundamentally, all of these gases that, once they're refined, are essentially interchangeable with fossil fuels, and maybe most importantly, can be used as vehicle fuel. And due to the kind of way the system is set up, the host of state and federal incentives that are pushing for this vehicle fuel option is what is most profitable for the big oil companies getting involved in this. Next slide, please. So to get into some of the private investment that we found in our report, we found that between 3 of the largest oil and gas companies, Chevron, Shell, and BP, they are funding, buying gas from, or otherwise financing and supporting at least 143 different digesters or upgrading facilities. And given kind of the rapid development of the industry and the black box that a lot of it lives in, this may or is likely to be an undercount. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go through each of these companies separately, as well as the largest players in the big ag arena, just to kind of give you an idea of who is getting involved in this, particularly the big bad names. So first up, we have Chevron. The biggest name here is their partnership with California Bioenergy, or CalBio. CalBio is a massive name in the industry, probably boosted by Chevron. It is also a very problematic company. But for their relationship, Chevron is mainly the funding arm of it, and CalBio does the development, kind of the applications, that sort of thing on the back end. Together, they already use 80,000 cows on their combined operations and operate at least 25 different digesters. Many of these are also in cluster systems. So the way those work is that they'll have several nearby farms, piping or trucking the manure or gas to a central facility for processing or upgrading. And then it can then be distributed into these pipelines. So for this partnership, it's often injected into the SoCalGas pipelines. Next, they also partner with Brightmark, where they have 18 digesters spread across 8 different states. They operate mostly in Iowa and Michigan. And in many cases for them, though not all of them, Chevron is really buying the gas off the project and selling it further by itself. If they're not doing that, it could be the similar thing of injecting into nearby pipelines. Clean Energy Fuels down in the corner is a little bit different. They have developed a project known as Adopt-A-Port, which they give truck operators in LA and Long Beach this RNG. So the fueling stations are owned by Clean Energy, and Chevron is supplying the RNG to them, probably from some of these ventures I just mentioned before. And Chevron has invested at least $28 million into this project. And then finally, we have Renewable Energy Group, which is a little bit different, but kind of still relevant to the greenwashing at hand. This is a biodiesel maker that Chevron purchased for $3.15 billion. Next slide, please. So next we have BP. And the first example we have is Archaea Energy, which is a little bit of an interesting example. There was a lot of back and forth between this company and BP. They originally had a partnership to build out digesters in the Central Valley, but ultimately BP moved to buy them out in 2022 for $4.1 billion. And that was, and still is, the largest yet factory farm gas acquisition. So now BP is operating those projects in the Central Valley, and this is a situation where the gas is being injected into the PG&E pipelines there. We see again, Clean Energy Fuels is back with BP. They have a co-marketing agreement between the two, with BP investing $50 million into this project. They work with dairies and other ag facilities in Iowa and South Dakota. And this folds into their work with Gevo, because that also operates in Iowa. They have 20,000 cows there, and BP buys the RNG produced from there and sells it through these agreements with Clean Energy Fuels. And finally, for BP, we also have Clean Bay Renewables. They have a 15-year contract together where BP is again going to buy the gas off them and selling it in California. This one is slightly different because they use poultry litter rather than dairies, like most of the other projects. Poultry litter is kind of its own set of disaster problems, but just know that this is going to help finance new projects in Maryland, as well as potential sites across the country. Next slide, please. So then last, for the oil groups, we have Shell. And Shell is a little different because, unlike the other ones, they seem to want to keep it in-house. They want to build and operate their own digesters and upgrading facilities. So they have one operational site currently, as well as several others under construction, including an upgrading facility. They also moved to buy out the Danish energy company Nature Energy for $2 billion. And Nature is the largest biogas producer in Europe. They have about 14 operating plants and I think 30 projects in the pipeline. So it's clear Shell is a little bit less with the partnerships than others, but still getting massively involved in this industry. Next slide, please. And for the big ag side of things, it's really Smithfield getting involved here. I'll touch on two smaller examples in a moment, but Smithfield has been out on top of this issue for far longer than the others. So they have also promised to put 100% or biogas on 100% of their finishing farms. So it's, clear that they're intending to scale this up as well. Their two big partnerships currently are with Dominion and Duke Energies. So for Dominion, they operate under the name Align RNG. This is very active in North Carolina, partially because they just have so many hog operations there. And they've also put hundreds of millions of dollars into this project. It's unclear exactly how much, but we do know that it was at least $325 million as of 2020. So it's likely that it's gone up since then. As for Duke Energies, they operate under the name Optima KV, again in North Carolina. And this involves hog waste from 5 different farms. And the gas is then injected into the Piedmont natural gas pipeline, which, spoiler, that's just Duke Energy's other name. It's just Piedmont is a subsidiary of Duke, so they're injecting it back into their own system. And then the final partnership here is with Roslyn Alternative Energies. And this is known under the name Monarch Bioenergy, and this one is active in Missouri. Next slide, please. So the other big ag names we have that we're kind of seeing just getting their foot in the door is Purdue and Tyson. This is likely to change in the future, as they see how successful this can be with other companies. But for now, Purdue has a 20-year supply agreement with Bioenergy DevCo, and this is to feed them their excess poultry and hatchery byproducts from their operations. Tyson is partnered with Northwest Natural for their beef packaging plants, and this began in 2021 in Nebraska. Next slide, please. So fundamentally, as we'll hear more about in a bit, this is leading to more emissions, not less. And there's also the fact that this system inherently depends on emissions, right? It can't function without having that methane to capture and allegedly redistribute, without having that pollutant that will inevitably leak out of the system. And this is not a sustainable energy. Unsurprisingly, it's just another attempt to greenwash these reputations. But at the same time, we see the oil and gas industry getting involved because it helps them ensure that their status quo can remain functioning exactly as it did before. Next slide, please. So while the industry would like to claim that this is a transformational clean energy, it's going to help us solve climate change, all of that lovely stuff, this is not true. And what we're seeing is that factory farm gas actually is deeply dependent on this fossil fuel infrastructure. It entrenches existing infrastructure and even expands on new parts of it. So for instance, the gas needs to get from one place to another. The primary way of doing that is through these pipelines. They want to upgrade it so it can go through these pipelines. I think Smithfield, in fact, built out a new pipeline to facilitate this. We're also seeing it could be heavy shipping trucks that need to haul materials back and forth, creating those emissions each time. One Shell-sponsored project that we looked at estimated that they would need 90 to 100 trucks every single day just to keep the facility operating. So it's quite clear who that benefits in that situation. Like I said, it could also depend on these gas grids, but also fundamentally, you need to have the ability to use the gas. So you need these gas hookups in place in your homes or in your vehicles because you need to get the gas in. So while you're pumping this supposedly green energy in, you're also keeping open the door for all of those other fossil fuels that could be going in as well. Next slide, please. And you'll hear a lot about this in a bit, but this will only worsen existing harms to communities. We know historically factory farm and fossil fuel placement has long been discriminatory, and because digesters need to be located near those, digesters will follow suit. So if you need to build out new pipelines, it's going to be through those communities that are already in danger and already being damaged by these operations. And again, historically, big oil has been a plague on all the communities it enters. Given all of the evidence surrounding the dangers of biogas and all of the technology that comes along with it, we cannot and really should not be choosing to trust them now. Final slide, please. So just to sum that all up, this is a very dangerous marriage between big ag and big oil. The climate and the surrounding communities will be the ones suffering as these two industries just continue to profit off of this status quo system. They're propping themselves up with this propaganda, calling it renewable, all of these things. And unfortunately, the state and federal incentives are only enabling them further. So with that, I will pass it to Chris Hunt with the Socially Responsible Agriculture Project.
Thank you, Kat. One of my general rules of thumb is that if ever there's something that's supported by Chevron and Shell and BP and Smithfield, it's probably not the best idea. So my name is Chris Hunt, Deputy Director at Socially Responsible Agriculture Project, or SRAP, and our organization works across the country to help communities that are facing the harmful impacts of factory farms. Next slide, please. So I don't have time to talk about all the damages the factory farms do, but they can be summarized in just 5 points. They threaten the environment, public health, socioeconomic conditions in rural communities, animal welfare, and as Kat mentioned, they are a serious environmental justice issue. These facilities are sited in disproportionately low-income communities and communities of color. Next slide, please. I think a key takeaway here is that factory farm gas doesn't address any one of those concerns that I just mentioned. It's not a solution for any of those things. Maybe it might reduce emissions a little bit, but it doesn't solve any of those other problems. And in fact, factory farm gas causes some new problems. So I'm not sure you can see the slide here, but the first issue is digestate. That's what comes out of the factory farm gas process. When you put all the waste in, it doesn't just disappear. Instead, it comes out in this concentrated form of digestate, which contains higher nutrient levels than ordinary manure, which means that there's greater pollution potential there, which is an issue because factory farms are already polluting waterways. You can see in the bottom right-hand corner, there's also pollution associated with the processing of biogas. In the middle there's the transportation of biogas in trucks and pipelines. I don't know about you, but a sustainable future to me does not involve a whole lot of trucks and cross-country pipelines all over the place. And finally, at the end of the day, you have to burn biogas. Next slide, please. And of course, burning biogas creates additional pollutants. And in fact, burning biogas is actually more polluting than burning normal natural gas. So there are higher levels of carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, VOCs, and formaldehyde. Next slide, please. So I actually deleted this slide this morning, but then I decided to add it back in because I think it's an important point. This technology isn't viable on small sustainable farms. This isn't something you can put in if you have a pasture-based operation. It relies on extreme concentration of animals that generate extreme quantities of waste. Next slide, please. So Kat mentioned all this corporate funding that's going toward biogas, but there's also a whole lot of federal funding and state funding that's going towards it. This funding can kind of be categorized into two sides. One is the funding for the infrastructure itself. So you have grant and loan programs like EQIP and REAP. You have tax incentives, and then you have technical assistance from folks like EPA's AgStar program. And then on the other side, you have funds being put towards propping up a market for that gas. So you have state renewable portfolio standards, federal renewable fuel standards, California's low carbon fuel standard. If you go into Appendix A of our report, you can actually find a whole list of all the subsidies and programs that are propping up factory farm gas. There are 24 of them listed. Next slide, please. I have a quote here from a dairy operator in California, the Mega Dairy. And the quote is, "We used to joke about how funny it would be if we could make more money off the poop than the milk. And now we're essentially here." So that's what's happening. Because of these subsidies that are going to prop up the biogas market, there's now an incentive to create more biogas. And there are essentially three ways that you can do that. You can add more animals to your factory farm, so there's more waste, so there's more biogas. You can consolidate smaller operations into larger mega farms, so you have a higher concentration of waste. And you can use manure management strategies that maximize methane generation. And Chloe's going to touch on that a little bit more in a bit. Next slide, please. So we've invested all these public funds in biogas, and we have all these corporate dollars going towards it. And okay, Chris, there are some problems associated with it, but hey, at least we're solving the climate crisis, right? Well, not really. It turns out that EPA's methane reduction estimates are based on a few false assumptions. One is that all waste is going to be stored in manure lagoons, which is the absolute worst way of managing it. And again, Chloe will discuss this in a bit. Two, it assumes that there's no increases in herd sizes. So it assumes that factory farms aren't adding more animals to generate more waste, which again, the results of our research show otherwise. And three, it assumes that you have a perfect system that has no leaks of methane at all. And a study in California used remote sensors and actually found that there was no difference in methane emissions between dairies that had digesters versus those that didn't. And then one final point on this slide, which I think if we do this presentation again, I might pull this out to make it its own slide. But according to EPA data, it turns out that 25% of the digesters that have been constructed in the US are no longer in operation. So not really a great return on investment for your climate dollars. And with that, I'll turn it over to Chloe.
Thank you so much, Chris. So this existing research that Chris just went into around how methane emission reductions from digesters are overstated was compelling, but it didn't necessarily account for how these methane reduction benefits may be overstated because of the perverse incentives that Chris discussed around herd sizes and using inferior manure management strategies. So we wanted to test that to model actual emissions changes from CAFOs with digesters, considering the perverse incentives to increase herd sizes and use inferior meaning most methane generating manure management strategies, because the more manure you produce, the more methane you produce, the worse strategies you use to store it, the more methane that you can capture and sell. So here's how we did it. We needed to get a before and an after figure for herd sizes. And this was hard because of a shocking lack of data collection and disclosure by federal and state governments, which we'll get into more later, and was admittedly a major limitation of our research. So we use the EPA's AgStar Livestock Anaerobic Digester database to pull herd size numbers from facilities that were still operational, not those 22% that had shuttered, that began operating in 2017 or earlier and were designated as large CAFOs. Then for the after or post-digester herd sizes, we used information on animal herd sizes pulled from NPDs or water permits that was at least as recent as 2020. Then we compared the year-over-year herd size changes for 73 dairies with digesters across 8 states to changes in statewide dairy herd sizes over the same period. Next slide. So indeed, our analysis affirmed our hypothesis, and we found that herd sizes at dairies with digesters grew 3.7% year over year. That is 24 times the growth rate for overall dairy herd sizes in the states covered by our data set. So that meant that the average dairy in our data set is predicted to add 855 cows in the next year if this trend that we found in the past were to continue into the future. More cows means more waste, and specifically 1,000 semi-trucks full of it. But then we went a step further and we projected that if the Biden administration's plan to install 500 new digesters came to fruition, and those CAFOs experienced a similar trend of herd size growth as the ones that we looked at, they would produce 12.5 million tons of additional waste each year. That additional waste is 6 times the amount of human waste produced in the state of California, which again, just really speaks to how these exacerbate the environmental justice issues that come with factory farms in the first place. Next slide. This graph just shows the breakdown by state. Since we know a lot of folks on this webinar are probably working at the state level, you may be curious, what was the trend in your state? And if your state is missing from this chart but has digesters, it probably means your state has not publicly posted NPD's permits at all or since 2019. Next slide. So we also sought to model methane reductions from hypothetical alternatives to digesters, such as decreasing herd sizes and implementing feasible alternative manure management practices. So we modeled changes in methane emissions for the dairies in our data set using different assumptions about what the baselines from which methane reductions were calculated and which strategies were used to reduce methane emissions. So sorry, this is going to be my most dense slide, but I want to walk you through these 3 scenarios we modeled. In the first one, we assumed that the baseline from which the emissions reductions from the digester are measured is the most methane generating or the worst case manure management strategy of an uncovered lagoon. Then we assume no changes in herd sizes. This is the set of assumptions that EPA uses when it estimates the methane reduction emissions from digesters. But in the second scenario, we assume instead that the baseline is a feasible alternative manure management scenario where half of the facility's manure was composted and half was in an uncovered lagoon. And here we account for the actual measured changes in herd sizes that we saw in the data. Then our third scenario assumes that most methane generating manure management strategy of an open lagoon as the baseline. But then instead of a digester being installed, we modeled what would happen if the CAFOs implemented feasible alternative manure management strategies and reduced their herd sizes by 20%. And importantly, this scenario can be applied to a large number of CAFOs, whereas digesters are only feasible at the largest CAFOs because of their cost and only with extensive subsidies. Next slide. So this slide shows what we found when comparing the first 2 scenarios for the dairies in our data set. In scenario 1, which is EPA's assumption that without a digester, these facilities would be employing the most methane generating practice of an open lagoon, and assumes there were no changes in herd sizes, an assumption that our last finding directly contradicted. So in this scenario, digesters look pretty good. They would reduce the emissions from these facilities by around 60%. That's that red bar in scenario 1. But in scenario 2, where we do account for the actual herd size changes, and we reject this assumption that without a digester, CAFOs would have to use the worst case scenario manure management strategy, the CAFOs would have only reduced their emissions by 11% from the baseline year to the most recent year for which herd size data was available. So the upshot is that EPA is likely significantly overestimating the emissions reduction potential of digesters. Next slide. So then we used all three scenarios to create projections for future methane reductions, comparing those to a 30% overall methane reduction target in the ag sector, which is aligned with the global methane pledge, a global pledge that the Biden administration has committed to. The first bar shows the Biden administration's own estimates for methane reductions from installing 500 digesters, 1,200 lagoon covers, and 250 solid separators. Now, they didn't share their math on this, and we think it's an ambitious estimate. But even their ambitious estimate with these flawed assumptions would achieve only a 9% reduction in agriculture methane emissions by 2030. And the ag sector accounts for more methane emissions than any other sector. So this is their best case scenario, and it doesn't come close to meeting the methane reduction targets that they've pledged to meet. The second bar is where we also came up with our own projections from installing 500 dairy digesters using the assumptions in the two scenarios we went over and the actual data from the dairies that were included in our data set. And here the shaded line indicates the difference between our high-end estimate, assuming no changes in herd size, and a baseline lagoon manure management strategy, scenario 1, and our low-end estimate accounting for actual changes in herd size and assuming a baseline of alternative manure management strategies. So in other words, our own research shows that the US will achieve somewhere between slightly fewer and far fewer emissions reductions than the 9% reduction projected by the Biden administration from installing digesters. So again, far short of the target. However, and here's the good news, we found that reducing herd sizes by 20% and implementing feasible alternative manure management strategies on 1,500 large dairy farms could yield 55% of the reductions that are needed to slash agricultural methane emissions by 30% in the year 2030. Next slide. So one of the weaknesses of digesters is that they're really expensive. A full cost-benefit analysis was beyond the scope of our research, but we did find that simply paying dairy producers to reduce their herd sizes would be 3 times more cost-effective than subsidizing methane digesters without all the harms of biogas that Chris and Kat have talked about. So we used CARB's calculation, the California Air Resource Board's calculation, that the cost of mitigating 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide by installing digesters was $29 per metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. Again, this is an optimistic estimate. A recent paper from Kevin Fingerman at Cal Poly Humboldt found that the cost of abating 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent through dairy digesters in California was far higher at $159 per metric ton. So then we compared that to the cost of paying farmers to reduce their herd sizes by just giving them a per cow payout equal to what they would have earned from producing milk from that cow. That came out to less than $10. So that's 3 times less than the cost of mitigating a ton of carbon dioxide equivalent from installing digesters, or 15 times less if we use the estimate from that Fingerman paper. And an added bonus to this is that paying farmers to reduce their herd sizes or transition to another type of farming altogether would also make dairy farming more profitable for the farmers who remain in the sector, because profits are currently suppressed by low prices driven by an oversupply relative to demand. And this wouldn't create the environmental justice issues from expanding factory farm gas. Next. So our last finding, and I touched on this briefly already, is that despite the extensive public investments in digesters that Chris talked about, the US government is not monitoring or reporting on methane emissions from CAFOs with digesters or collecting basic information such as animal populations in ways that are necessary to understand whether these investments are resulting in actual greenhouse gas reductions. So that should be reason enough to halt these investments. Like, we don't know that they're working at all. Overarching policy recommendation, next slide, is that resources supporting manure biogas should be redirected to more cost-effective methane reduction solutions that do not exacerbate environmental justice and industry consolidation. Instead, our policy should support a just transition away from factory farming to regenerative agriculture and away from fossil fuels to truly renewable energy. Next slide. So I won't go through each of our additional policy recommendations for the sake of time because they're detailed in our report, but The gist of it is that we need to stop public funding of factory farm gas. We need to track and regulate methane emissions from CAFOs and digesters like we would for any other sector. And we need to pursue methane reduction strategies for the ag sector that support environmental justice and fair markets for producers and are actually effective at reducing methane emissions in line with targets. Next slide. So in closing, I just wanted to share a quote from our report that I think captures our key findings and policy recommendations. Solar energy is renewable because the sun will keep shining, and wind energy is renewable because the wind will keep blowing. Manure biogas can only be considered renewable if we accept that factory farms will keep spewing pollution into rural communities, fueling the climate crisis with emissions from animal feed and enteric fermentation, and raising billions of animals in intolerably cruel conditions that risk public health year after year. We should not accept that. Instead, we should implement policies that support a just transition away from factory farming to regenerative agriculture and away from fossil fuels to truly renewable energy. So that's it for me. And I will pass it on to Leslie Martinez from the Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. So I am our community engagement specialist from Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability. We are a CBO, a community-based organization here in the San Joaquin Valley and also in the Eastern Coachella Valley. We do work on a variety of issues from land use, energy, transportation, water and wastewater services. We kind of do it all. But a lot of the work that we do is really grounded in just community co-powerment. So what we focus on is ensuring that while we're finding solutions for some of the state's problems around the environment, we're doing it right with community, making sure that these solutions are like their priorities and how they want to move it along. So I'm really lucky to work at this organization. I'm also really lucky because I'm actually from the San Joaquin Valley, born and raised and never leaving, fingers crossed. If I could go to the next slide. So I think you've heard from a lot of folks today about, a lot of the data that calls, the BS on these type of projects. But this part, I think I'm really going to focus around like what it's like to live with these projects. What does that do to community? What does that look like? Unfortunately, residents couldn't be here today, but they're much better at talking about this. So I'm going to do my best. But it's, I think it's first, the most important thing to talk about is kind of setting the scene for the San Joaquin Valley for those that aren't familiar with it. It is the agriculture powerhouse of the nation. It is one of our top exports outside of oil and gas. But on the other side of it, it's also where people actually live. In the San Joaquin Valley, where we have some of the biggest like dairies in the state. We're talking upwards of 2,000 cows. Like that is, I think the average dairy farm is about 1,500 cows right now. It might have gone down since the ag census just came out. The history of the San Joaquin Valley is rooted in extractive practices, whether that's extracting groundwater at absurd rates that we can't even refill our aquifers. It's the most changed landscape in like the world, meaning like the industrial agriculture is really what the norm in how we produce food here in the San Joaquin Valley, and getting people to change that mindset has been very difficult, even though we're getting clear signs from like beautiful Mother Earth that we cannot do that anymore. I know a lot of folks think of the California as a climate leader. I would push back on that because a lot of the way that California policy is created is at the expense of some people so others can thrive, unfortunately, which is why there's a lot of environmental racism issues here. Today, as you can see, the San Joaquin Valley, we're very dense in cows, but on the other side, we also have incredible like problems with water quality. We have a lot of farm workers, low wage workers who are also exploited by this extractive agricultural industry. But I don't want to shed this like sad light because I promise that community residents are like, we're coming out of this on top. Can I go to the next slide, please? I'm not going to go into some of these things. We know what air quality, the air quality that comes from these methanes, but it's important to know what does that look like. I'm going to share a story from Kathy, who is a grandmother, a wife, and a mother, and a caretaker to her husband who's losing his sight. And she is the most amazing, fun woman in the world. She calls them her grandbabies. So she loves her grandkids. And, some of the stories she tells me is her grandkids live in the Bay Area and they don't want to come to her house. They know they don't like coming to her house. And when you ask, when they ask them why, and they said it's because it smells, it's stinky where you live, which breaks her heart every time. And what that looks like is it's a smell and it's like air quality that you cannot escape. A lot of the folks that we work with are farm workers and they live in old homes that frankly need a lot of upgrades. But unfortunately, on farm worker salaries, you can't afford that. A lot of the homes in the San Joaquin Valley, regardless of us having some of the hottest days and the coldest winters in California, most folks can't afford having AC infrastructure. That means that there's no filtration really going through homes. People say open your windows. A lot of the homes don't have any more screens because they're old. And frankly, people like Kathy have to open up their windows to get some breeze in during some of the hot summers. And what that looks like is kids who live next to dairies, having to go outside during recess. They're breathing in this air. They're swatting the flies away from them. A lot of, San Joaquin Valley is one of the most contaminated air basins in the nation. And there seems to be like really no push for change with the dairies. As you've heard from other folks before, like they're not regulated at all. So, and in some local counties, they're allowed to add cows without telling anybody. So a lot of residents don't really know what these dairies are doing in their own backyards. What they do know is the smell. They know the asthma attacks. They know the getting on the freeway to go to the emergency room because their kid can't breathe at night. We know so many young children who suffer with sleep apnea because like they cannot breathe at night. And it's more common for people in the San Joaquin Valley to have asthma than to not. When you don't have asthma and you're from the San Joaquin Valley, everybody's like, how do you not have that? Like, oh my God, that's amazing. And unfortunately, like that is the norm here. Like that is how we treat like people who live next to dairies. It's like, oh, that sucks. But they never really come to think about like, what are those, like, what does that do to somebody's lungs? What does the dust do? What does like irritants do? We work with families and residents who their kids can never go outside. That leads to awful mental health issues for young children. It leads to a lot of parents wondering like, why we're allowing schools to be less than a mile away from like a mega dairy. I'm talking, I think it's 4,000 cows, the one that's closest to Pixley School. And all of this is met with, if you don't like it, you can leave. But unfortunately, like folks like where they live. And I don't think that, and we as an organization, I think like as humans, should be our first priority should be protecting people rather than an industry that has really been given free rein because of the power they've accumulated in the legislature, in the California legislature, and different agencies. Can we go to the next slide? But it's not just air quality that happens, right? Like I think a lot of people also forget that dairies are like, there's like these beautiful animals that live. I have nothing against animals. I love these animals. And it makes me so sad that they are living in like 100+ degree weather and they need water, right? Like they need to drink water. But on top of that, the way that a lot of dairies manage manure is by, it's like a wet manure practice. So they spray down the water and that's a lot of water that is being used, okay? Like, and water that frankly, the San Joaquin Valley does not have. And I think a lot of people see it as like this victimless crime, unfortunately, where they just think like, well, they need the water to, for the cows. But what that leads to is communities who are on small community water systems, community residents that are on like single family wells. That leads to contamination. We're talking blue baby syndrome, which is what happens when a young baby comes in contact with like nitrate, that they just cannot breathe. I work with a resident in Planada who they are told not to wash baby bottles with the water, with like the water that's comes out of their faucet. They are told to specifically use like water that they purchase. The other thing is we're working with community residents who oftentimes the water quality, a lot of them don't know what's happening because like testing your well is expensive. And a lot of times, the small water systems, it's very expensive to clean out nitrate. It's expensive to like clean out this any contaminant that comes in them. And nitrate is sometimes only one of the like 5 contaminants, because the industrial agriculture has also pushed us to dig so deep that sometimes we hit arsenic, sometimes we hit other different, like TCP123 is a really big is a pesticide that was outlawed because it was connected to cancer, and that's also found in some of the water wells in the San Joaquin Valley. And a lot of this accumulates into community residents having issues with water quality and water quantity, meaning that they're also paying for water that they cannot drink. They are paying, and that is money that they don't have a lot of the times. And this has just become a norm for rural communities in the San Joaquin Valley. This is not, it is also, I think, the dairy industry has done a very good job at making sure that they are picking communities that are so far away from where decision making goes. They don't have direct representation. Oftentimes, you know, their supervisors are making decisions up to an hour away from where they live, with no public, like we don't have public transportation. There is a lot of folks don't drive. Folks are undocumented and, you know, are often scared of like leaving their small communities. And I think the other part of this is like, you'll hear like, oh, but like they're an organic farm, but residents can't even afford like anything to be organic. Like they can barely afford the food that they have on their table. Can we go to the next slide? And that's all to say that like people in Pixley, like this is what they live, like this is what they smell, and this is what they like have to like live through every single day. I think a lot of people, at least this was enough for a lot of community residents in the San Joaquin Valley to be like, okay, this is enough. Like we're taking a stand. So we could go to the next slide. So we did. We work with community residents throughout the San Joaquin Valley. I think it's over 5 counties. We got together and they all started talking about specifically like how can we make sure that like these dairies stop growing. We work in a community with the dairy digester cluster, and we work with communities who have seen what that cluster has done to a community. For example, in Pixley, we've seen residents, more cows, the smell of ammonia is starting, it like comes out in the community. There has been no benefit to the community at all with these digesters, even though they're like touted as like God's gift to earth. But unfortunately, like that's not what we're seeing. So can we go to the next slide? So what we did is we worked with community residents and we started pushing back on where we could find opportunities. I think we've mentioned the low carbon fuel standard. That's really one of the places where we've been working over the last year. We've met with board members to really work on the rulemaking. We've attended the workshops, we write comments, residents ran a bill that we tried to get through the legislature to fix the LCFS. The California legislature sent a letter to CARB saying that they needed to make changes, and all of this is rooted in community advocacy. As you can see, like I am just merely like at these folks' disposal to ensure that they can breathe air and just be happy where they live. And we're continuing to do this work. We're not going to stop, even though unfortunately CARB has been very set on not listening to us. They didn't include any community comments in their release of their new rulemaking. So very like strong opposition to community residents. Can we go to the final slide? But that's just not to say that community is going to stop. We're going to continue. We're going to fight for people to have clean drinking air. If there's one thing I just want to leave folks with is, although I'm talking about like a lot of impacts that people are facing with these dairies and dairy digesters, as we continue to see the infrastructure grow, the biogas pipelines continue to go to communities and continue to really like plague these folks, and also like not give them any space to fight back, unfortunately. Like that's the other part. But the San Joaquin Valley is not a dumping ground. It is not a sacrifice zone for the state of California and the dairy industry in the entire nation. San Joaquin Valley residents are like, we're full of life here. We have things to do. We are a beautiful community filled of laughter and love. And I think we're going to continue to push for that. So with that, I just want to say thank you so much to everybody. And excited to continue to working on this alongside folks in the San Joaquin Valley and our partners.
Great. Thank you all so much. I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen so you can see all of our wonderful speakers. Now we're going to dig into just a couple questions and answers. And so just to start, I think this is a question for Chris and for Chloe. You know, are any of the, and Kat as well, are any of these ventures actually profitable without the federal and state subsidies?
No, I think it's a short answer. I mean, without any of the subsidies, no, they're just not. The inputs are just more expensive than the gas that you're selling from it. If you're just selling the gas on the commercial market, you can't make money from these things.
Great. Another question we got kind of in advance was, do methane digesters stop carbon dioxide from being emitted into the air? Do they stop any other greenhouse gas emissions other than methane?
You know, we didn't look super closely at carbon dioxide emissions, and that is EPA is not looking at that either in their methodology. I actually think what's more important to look at is the nitrous oxide emissions, which there's evidence that digesters, and especially in the storage of the digestate, increase nitrous oxide emissions. And this, again, is not accounted for in the methodology that EPA uses to calculate the methane reduction benefits. Nitrous oxide being a greenhouse gas that's even more potent than both methane and carbon dioxide.
And I'll just add on there, it is striking and also totally insane that all these public dollars are going towards this technology when there's not a clear understanding of what the actual impacts are. And I just wanted to make one shout out to my colleague, Lynn Henning, who's the one who was responsible for actually doing the digging into the NIPD's permits. It took my colleague going through permit by permit to see what the herd size changes are. Nobody's actually recording that. And so nobody has any idea what the impact of this technology is, despite all the money being put towards it.
Thank you. Kat, I think this is a question for you, but let me see, now I lost it. Can you talk a little bit about, you know, how the oil and farms are kind of working together, and just like, do the oil companies own infrastructure on private farms? Is it more of a partnership?
Yeah, so it's kind of an interesting dynamic that we also don't know too much about, because a lot of these agreements are very hidden, they're very private, they're not necessarily in the public domain. And it also depends on the project, right? But what we do know is that from some of these examples, oftentimes the farms may be on the hook for the digesters themselves, in which case that is extremely expensive technology. But in other cases, it could be facilitated by these companies. Typically, if you are, you know, the infrastructure that is really owned by the oil and gas company might be the pipeline, or it might be the upgrading facility. It is not typically the digester itself. I think, you know, Shell is probably the big exception to that, because that's the one really taking it under their own wing and kind of doing it on their own. But also you have all these middlemen, all of these different cow bios popping up to kind of run that interference and run those lines between these companies, and also blur those lines as well.
Another question we got ahead of time is, what should farmers do with manure, or what are solutions beyond converting it to energy?
So, you know, that's one of the things that our report spoke to, is that we need to transition away from CAFOs altogether. In our view, there's just CAFOs are fundamentally incompatible with environmental justice and solving the climate crisis. And so how we get there, you know, a lot of our organizations support Senator Booker's Farm System Reform Act. I know we had several questions around kind of what is the legislation that moves us in this direction. And starting to shift, we need to help farmers to transition away from CAFOs to other types of agriculture. And that could be regenerative livestock production, pasture-based livestock production, could be shifting into a different type of agriculture, non-animal agriculture altogether. And the Farm System Reform Act contemplates this. We talked already about the efficiency in terms of reducing climate emissions of just paying farmers directly to reduce their dairy herd sizes. What the Farm System Reform Act does is it would put a moratorium on new CAFOs and create a voluntary buyout for existing CAFOs to move away from this type of agriculture altogether. I know there are also questions about, the Cows Act and alternative manure management strategies for farms that currently are CAFOs. And, we do think that those are better solutions than manure biogas because they don't come with some of these costs that we mentioned, the increased ammonia, for example, that comes from digester emissions. And they don't function to entrench factory farming and fossil fuels for the next decades to come. So I do think that those are important things to look at, but ultimately, a CAFO using alternative manure management practices is still going to be incompatible with those goals of supporting the community that's living nearby.
Thank you, Chloe. I think there's a couple questions around like digestate, and so can you all talk a little bit about just like the digestate itself, the dangers that it poses, and kind of what, if any, oversight there is around the spreading of digestate?
I need to talk about that one too. So digestate is essentially manure, but more highly concentrated. And so digestate manure does have nutrients that are good for the soil. I saw somebody ask, is this good for the microbiome? And it's all about the quantities in which you're applying them. And in most of the places that are really concentrated with CAFOs, there's an oversupply of these nutrients that are leaching into waterways and causing issues like eutrophication and water pollution. So digestate is essentially manure on steroids in that sense. And if you put digestate, especially if you apply it in ways that are that are not ideal, like if you're applying it in the winter or you're, not injecting it into the land, but spraying it, that can be more dangerous than applying fresh manure. And that's something even USDA acknowledges. So right now, one of the other policy recommendations we have is to better regulate the application of digestate on this land as well, which is just another area that, like so many other aspects of CAFOs, is just drastically underregulated with insufficient oversight.
And then I think just the last question for Leslie. Do you know if there are like higher rates of cancer within, the Central Valley, but then also, can you share a little bit about like what, these communities see as a better solution than manure biogas?
Yeah, I think that I think that there are various things that happen in farm worker communities. Like for example, lack of access to just like medical care is it's oftentimes hospitals in the San Joaquin Valley are actually closing. Like NICUs are closing throughout the state. So definitely, the other thing is that we don't have studies. Like their CARB doesn't require a public health study to be done by communities, even though that is what they're asking for. There's no local community monitoring of the air quality next to these communities as well. The last part of the question, what was it again? I'm so sorry, I'm blanking.
Oh, just kind of sharing a little bit more about like what the community sees, in the Central Valley, like what do they see as like what we should be doing instead of supporting manure biogas?
Methane regulation. We regulate that is a number one ask. In fact, the California legislature has had this power since January 1st of 2024, and they have declined to use that power. They are not thinking about how they can regulate methane. And frankly, I think coming back to some of the other points folks were making before, if we really want to continue having dairy, CAFOs are just not it. That's not going to be the future of dairy. But what we're really doing is also a disservice to the industry and to some of the owners. Folks who have small dairies are not making it in California. They cannot afford to continue to keep up with the big industrial ag milkers. We really have to rethink the way that we do agriculture, and we have to begin regulating now so we can send signals to the market that these changes in California are going to happen, and they're going to have to happen throughout the nation, or else truly we might have to say goodbye to ice cream and cheese and milk as a whole, because we are just sending just like false solutions to these like families who are trying to live off making milk. And that's not a possibility anymore, at least in the San Joaquin Valley. And we're seeing that with the trends of small dairies closing and consolidating into bigger, like more confined animals in the same space.
Thank you, Leslie. I think that's a good note to end on. And so I apologize, we did not even get close to as many of the questions asked, but we will be sending a recording of this webinar along with the slides out afterwards. You'll have my contact information, so you can always follow up with us directly with those questions. We'll also share links to the reports and some of the resources that we discussed today. But we just want to thank you all so much for attending. And for learning more about sort of the negative impacts of the proliferation of factory farm gas. Hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.